What would you do if you lost your child in war and then met the man who plays Jesus on TV? Robert McKenna found out on a cold November day at his son's grave, 18 years after Danny died in Afghanistan. The confrontation that followed would transform both men and eventually help hundreds of other military families find peace in their grief. The morning fog hung thick over Arlington National Cemetery as Robert McKenna made his familiar walk down the perfectly aligned rows of white headstones. November 15, 2024. 18 years to the day since two uniformed officers had knocked on his door in suburban Maryland with news that would shatter his world into pieces that never quite fit back together the same way. 18 years of making this same pilgrimage, carrying flowers that would wilt and questions that never seemed to find satisfying answers. Robert was 63 now, his once dark hair completely gray, his shoulders bearing the invisible weight of nearly 2 decades of grief that had settled into his bones like arthritis. The crisp autumn air bit at his face as he approached Section 60, where America's newest heroes rested beneath marble markers that seemed too small to contain the magnitude of their sacrifice. Each step on the frost-covered grass felt heavier than the last, not from age, but from the accumulating weight of years spent wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Danny McKenna had been 22 when an improvised explosive device ended his tour of duty in Afghanistan permanently. Fresh out of college with a degree in engineering, he had enlisted because he wanted to make a difference, to serve something greater than himself. Robert had been proud and terrified in equal measure, understanding that his only son was walking into danger, but respecting the young man's desire to contribute to something meaningful beyond his own comfort and security. The phone call had come on a Tuesday morning in November 2006. Robert remembered every detail with crystalline clarity, the way the autumn sunlight had been streaming through his kitchen window, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the table, the precise temperature of his coffee cup when he set it down to answer what would become the most important and devastating phone call of his life. 2 simple sentences had rewritten his entire understanding of God, purpose, and whether faith meant anything when tested by genuine tragedy. For 18 years, Robert had been coming to this same spot, standing before the same white marble headstone, trying to make sense of why a benevolent God would allow a young man with so much potential to die in a desert on the other side of the world. Danny had been planning to marry his college sweetheart Sarah when his deployment ended. They had talked about children, careers, the house they wanted to buy in a neighborhood with good schools and mature trees. All of those dreams were buried here beneath Robert's feet, along with his own faith in divine justice. The questions had multiplied over the years rather than diminishing. If God was truly in control, why hadn't he protected Danny? If prayer actually worked, why hadn't 2 decades of desperate pleading brought his son back, or at least provided some sense of peace about his absence? If there was really a greater plan that required Danny's death, what could possibly be important enough to justify stealing a young man's future and devastating his family? Robert had tried church, therapy, grief counseling, and meditation retreats. He had read books about finding meaning in suffering and attended support groups for military families who had lost children in combat. Some approaches had provided temporary relief, brief moments when the weight felt slightly more bearable, but nothing had addressed the fundamental rage that burned in his chest whenever he thought about the God who was supposed to love his children, but had allowed Danny to die in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. This particular November morning felt different somehow, though Robert couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps it was the unusual thickness of the fog, or the way the bare tree branches seemed to reach toward heaven like desperate fingers. Maybe it was simply the accumulation of 18 years of unprocessed grief finally reaching some kind of critical mass that demanded resolution. Whatever the cause, Robert felt more emotionally volatile than usual as he approached Danny's grave with his customary bundle of flowers. That's when he noticed the other man standing just 3 graves away, head bowed in what appeared to be prayer or meditation. Tall, with shoulder-length brown hair and a beard, wearing a dark jacket that looked expensive enough to suggest Hollywood money. There was something familiar about his profile, something that nagged at Robert's memory as he tried to place where he might have seen this particular face before. Recognition hit Robert like a physical blow when the man raised his head and turned slightly in his direction. Jonathan Roumie, the actor who played Jesus in that television series his late wife Margaret had loved watching before her own death from cancer 3 years earlier. The man who had made millions of dollars pretending to be the Son of God while real families like Robert suffered losses that would have tested even the biblical Job's famous patience. The sight of Roumie in this sacred place, where real sacrifice was memorialized in marble and bronze, triggered something primal in Robert's chest. Here was someone who had never lost a child, never buried a son, never felt the silence of heaven when you needed God most desperately. Yet this actor had the audacity to portray divine love and comfort to television audiences, while families like Robert's lived with the daily reality of unanswered prayers and absent miracles. Robert found himself walking toward Jonathan before his rational mind could intervene and suggest that confronting a stranger in a cemetery might not be the most appropriate way to process 18 years of suppressed rage. But rational thought had little influence over emotions that had been building pressure like steam in a sealed container for nearly 2 decades. This encounter felt inevitable, as if the universe had finally provided a target for all the fury that had nowhere else to go. Jonathan looked up as Robert approached, his expression shifting from meditative peace to concern as he recognized the intensity radiating from the older man. There was something in Robert's eyes that suggested this wouldn't be a casual conversation between strangers who happened to be visiting the same cemetery. This felt like confrontation, the kind of moment that either breaks people entirely or transforms them in ways they never expected. Robert stopped directly in front of Jonathan, close enough that the actor could see decades of grief etched into every line of his weathered face. The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats, heavy with unspoken pain and questions that had been fermenting in Robert's soul since that terrible Tuesday morning in November 2006. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of wrestling with God in the darkness. The words that emerged weren't the polite small talk typically exchanged between strangers in public spaces. Robert's question cut straight to the theological heart of human suffering with the precision of a surgeon's blade and the force of a sledgehammer. He wanted to know where exactly God had been when Danny's convoy hit that roadside bomb. He needed to understand why a supposedly loving deity would allow young men to die in foreign wars while actors in Hollywood made fortunes pretending to represent divine compassion. But what transformed this from a simple confrontation into something approaching sacred encounter was what happened next. Jonathan didn't offer defensive explanations about his role being fictional or attempt to redirect Robert's anger toward more appropriate targets. Instead, he absorbed the full impact of the grieving father's pain with the same intensity he brought to studying Scripture for his performances. He listened to Robert's rage as if it contained truths about faith that could fundamentally alter his understanding of what it means to represent Christ in a broken world. Jonathan recognized that Robert's questions weren't abstract theological puzzles to be solved through clever reasoning. They were desperate cries from a father's heart that had been shattered by loss and then abandoned by the very God who was supposed to provide comfort in times of unbearable suffering. This wasn't about winning an argument or defending his career choices. This was about honoring the sacred nature of a parent's grief while somehow finding words that could bridge the chasm between faith and profound loss. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, continuing long after both men's feet had grown numb from standing on frozen ground. They talked about the nature of suffering, the silence of God, and whether faith meant anything when tested by genuine tragedy. Jonathan shared his own struggles with portraying divine love while feeling inadequate to offer comfort to people facing losses he had never experienced personally. Robert described the 18 years he had spent coming to the cemetery, hoping for some sign that Danny's death had meaning beyond the official explanations about fighting terrorism and spreading democracy. What emerged wasn't a dramatic moment of healing or sudden resolution to decades of unanswered questions. Instead, something more subtle and perhaps more genuinely powerful began developing between 2 men who had approached this encounter as strangers but were discovering unexpected common ground in their shared humanity and spiritual seeking. Robert began to see that his anger at God might actually be a form of prayer, a refusal to accept easy answers that dishonored the magnitude of his loss. Jonathan helped Robert understand that his persistent return to Danny's grave, his inability to simply move on and forget, represented a kind of faithfulness that many people who had never been tested by real tragedy might never access. The fact that Robert continued to engage with God, even in anger and disappointment, suggested a relationship that was actually deeper and more honest than polite religious observance that had never been challenged by genuine suffering. As they continued talking, Jonathan began to understand something that had eluded him throughout his years portraying Jesus on television. The role had taught him to speak about divine love and comfort in ways that sounded convincing to audiences who were seeking inspiration and hope. But standing in this cemetery with Robert McKenna, he was learning what it actually means to encounter Christ in the midst of inconsolable loss and unanswerable questions about divine justice. Robert's pain was too authentic and immediate to be addressed through rehearsed theological explanations or inspirational platitudes that worked well in scripted scenes. This required something more honest and vulnerable, something that acknowledged the genuine mystery of suffering without pretending to have satisfying explanations for why young fathers die in foreign wars while their children grow up without them. The breakthrough moment came when Jonathan stopped trying to defend God's goodness and instead simply sat with Robert in the reality of his loss. Rather than offering explanations for why Danny had to die, Jonathan began honoring the magnitude of what Robert had lost and the faithfulness he had demonstrated by continuing to show up at this grave for 18 years, even when showing up brought more questions than comfort. This shift from explanation to accompaniment created space for something unexpected to emerge in Robert's understanding of his own grief journey. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he began to consider the possibility that his anger at God might actually be evidence of faith rather than its absence. Perhaps his refusal to accept Danny's death as simply meaningless tragedy represented a kind of spiritual stubbornness that honored both his son's memory and his own need for ultimate justice. Jonathan suggested that Robert's 18-year pilgrimage to this cemetery demonstrated the kind of persistence that biblical figures like Job and David had shown when wrestling with God in their own dark nights of the soul. The Psalms were full of prayers that sounded remarkably similar to Robert's questions about divine justice and the apparent silence of heaven when good people suffered undeserved losses. What if Robert's grief wasn't a sign of weak faith, but rather evidence of love so strong that it refused to be comforted by inadequate explanations? What if his inability to move on represented a loyalty to Danny's memory that God honored even when it expressed itself through anger and disappointment? What if his questions were actually prayers that God welcomed because they came from a heart that still cared enough to engage with ultimate questions about meaning and justice? As the fog began lifting and other cemetery visitors started arriving for their own pilgrimages to remember loved ones, both men realized they had been changed by their unexpected encounter. Robert felt something shifting in his chest, not the dramatic healing of television movies, but a subtle softening of the rage that had defined him for so long. His questions hadn't been answered, but they had been honored by someone who understood that some pain is too sacred to be quickly resolved. Jonathan left Arlington that day with a deeper appreciation for the weight of representing Christ to people who were facing genuine tragedy rather than fictional dramatic situations. Robert's grief had taught him that his role carried responsibilities that extended far beyond entertainment, and that the people who watched The Chosen deserved portrayals of divine love that could withstand the test of real suffering rather than idealized spiritual comfort. The impact of their conversation extended far beyond that November morning in Arlington National Cemetery. Robert began attending a support group for military families, not because his own pain had been magically healed, but because he had discovered that his questions and anger might actually help other parents who were struggling with similar losses. His willingness to voice the doubts that many grieving parents felt but were afraid to express created space for more honest conversations about faith, loss, and the challenge of maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish. Jonathan incorporated his encounter with Robert into his preparation for future scenes involving grief, loss, and divine comfort. His portrayal of Jesus became more grounded in authentic understanding of human suffering, less reliant on theological abstractions, and more connected to the practical work of sitting with people in their darkest moments without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed or explain what couldn't be understood. 6 months after their cemetery meeting, Robert received a call from Jonathan asking if he would be willing to speak at a gathering for military families who had lost children in combat. The event was being organized by a veterans group that had heard about Robert's story and thought his honesty about struggling with faith after loss might help other parents who were carrying similar questions and anger. Robert's first inclination was to decline. He wasn't a counselor or chaplain or anyone particularly qualified to offer guidance to other grieving parents, but something about Jonathan's invitation felt like an opportunity to transform his own pain into something that might serve others who were walking similar paths through grief and spiritual questioning. The event took place at a community center near Arlington, with about 40 military families in attendance. Robert had prepared remarks, but found himself abandoning his notes and simply sharing his story honestly, including the anger, the doubts, and the 18 years of questions that had no satisfying answers. He talked about meeting Jonathan at Danny's grave and how that conversation had helped him understand that faithful questioning might be more valuable than false comfort. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Parent after parent approached Robert afterward, thanking him for voicing thoughts they had been afraid to express, even to themselves. Many had been struggling with guilt about their anger at God, wondering if their doubts meant they were failing their deceased children or dishonoring their sacrifice. Robert's willingness to acknowledge these difficult emotions publicly created permission for others to stop pretending their grief was more resolved than it actually was. That first gathering led to monthly meetings, then quarterly regional conferences, and eventually a national organization dedicated to supporting military families through honest engagement with loss, rather than premature pressure to find meaning or move forward before they were ready. Robert found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for parents who needed space to grieve fully rather than quickly. Jonathan remained involved as well, not as a celebrity endorser, but as someone genuinely committed to learning from military families about the real cost of war and the authentic nature of faith under extreme pressure. His participation in these gatherings informed his portrayal of Jesus in ways that made his performance more grounded in actual human experience rather than idealized spiritual concepts. The ripple effects continued expanding as families who had been helped by Robert's honesty began reaching out to other military parents in their communities. Veterans organizations started incorporating discussions about spiritual struggle into their support programming. Chaplains began receiving training about how to support families whose faith had been challenged rather than strengthened by loss. 3 years after their initial encounter, Robert and Jonathan collaborated on a book about faith, grief, and the challenge of maintaining hope when hope seems impossible. The book wasn't written by experts offering solutions, but by two men who had discovered that some questions are more important than their answers, and that genuine healing often begins with admitting how broken we actually are. The book's success led to speaking engagements at military bases, veterans' hospitals, and conferences for military families. Robert's story resonated with thousands of parents who had felt isolated in their struggle to reconcile faith with devastating loss. His message wasn't that grief gets easier or that God's plan becomes clearer with time, but that faithful questioning is itself a form of worship that honors both our loved ones and our need for ultimate meaning. Jonathan's involvement in this ministry transformed his approach to playing Jesus in ways that affected millions of viewers worldwide. His portrayal became more realistic about the cost of love, more honest about the mystery of suffering, and more grounded in authentic compassion for people facing impossible circumstances. Critics and audiences alike noticed the depth and authenticity that characterized his later performances. 5 years after their cemetery encounter, Robert McKenna still visits Danny's grave every November 15th. But now he goes not just as a grieving father carrying unanswered questions, but as someone who has discovered that his pain can serve others who are walking similar paths through loss and spiritual questioning. His annual pilgrimage has become part of a larger mission to ensure that no military family faces grief alone or feels ashamed for struggling with faith after devastating loss. The white headstone marking Danny McKenna's grave still bears the same inscription it carried on that foggy November morning when two strangers met and discovered they had more in common than either had expected. But the meaning of that memorial has expanded beyond honoring one young soldier's sacrifice to representing hope for all families who refuse to let their questions be silenced by premature comfort or false explanations. This is what genuine ministry looks like when stripped of its religious packaging and reduced to its essential components: broken people refusing to let other broken people suffer alone, questions being honored even when answers remain elusive, and pain being transformed into purpose, not through dramatic healing, but through gradual recognition that our deepest wounds might also be our greatest sources of compassion for others who are bleeding in similar ways. Robert McKenna and Jonathan Roumie met as strangers in a cemetery and became partners in a mission neither had planned but both recognized as essential. They learned that some encounters are too sacred to be dismissed as coincidence, that some questions are more valuable than their answers, and that authentic faith often looks more like wrestling than worship, more like honest struggle than confident assurance. In a world that prefers neat conclusions and inspirational messages that make suffering seem purposeful, they chose instead to sit with mystery, honor grief, and create space for others to do the same. Their story continues to unfold through every military family who finds permission to grieve honestly, every parent who discovers that faithful questioning is itself a form of prayer, and every person who learns that healing often begins not with answers, but with the courage to ask the hardest questions out loud.